Ludwig Wittgenstein is probably the most important philosopher of the 20th century, and a remarkable figure in that he was said to have solved philosophy, not once, but twice. Now, of course, the very idea that one could solve philosophy, in my view, would be sort of like saying that one could solve politics or solve morality. So long as human life goes on, there are going to be questions, challenges, and contradictions that we have to confront. These decisions will require a criterion of judgment, and as life goes on, we're going to find that the answers that may have been adequate in the past no longer satisfy us. And perhaps the life and work of Wittgenstein himself is the best example of this. Because after all, if you can solve philosophy twice, this would mean that the first solution was apparently not really a solution, or perhaps it was only a solution for a given objective or in a given context. As life went on, Wittgenstein required a new approach. Wittgenstein was born to one of the richest families in Austria in 1889. His father's company held a monopoly on iron and steel products in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Wittgenstein family home was nothing short of palatial, and it served as a salon, a gathering place for prominent cultural figures such as the musicians Brahms and Mahler. Ludwig's father wished for him to follow in his own footsteps, just as had been expected of Ludwig Wittgenstein's older brothers, although none of them seemed interested or suited to this task, much to the family's disappointment. In fact, 3 of Ludwig Wittgenstein's older brothers chose to end their lives, probably at least partially in some cases due to the pressures put on to them. But life would take the young Ludwig on a very different path. He began to study engineering, which was to the liking of his father, since this represented a practical, lucrative education relevant to the family's business interests. However, Wittgenstein instead began to find himself drawn to the field of mathematics as a result of his study of engineering problems, which often involved mathematical problems. Upon entering this new world of math, he practically became obsessed with understanding the foundations of mathematics. And given the developments that had occurred in academic philosophy during that time, that interest led him to Bertrand Russell. Wittgenstein had an obsessive mind. He feverishly studied the work of Russell, particularly his Principles of Mathematics, as well as the work of Gottlob Frege. In 1911, Wittgenstein visited Frege, who suggested that he go and study under Russell. Wittgenstein arrived at Cambridge unannounced and introduced himself. He began attending Russell's lectures, following Russell around to ask him questions and converse with him, and he would linger late at night in Russell's room, continuing the dialogue into the late hours when Russell would finally, reluctantly have to tell Wittgenstein that it was time to go to bed. This may give you the impression that Ludwig Wittgenstein was quite annoying, but Bertrand Russell soon came to find him quite endearing. In fact, he eventually came to believe that Wittgenstein was a genius. For all his admiration for Russell, Wittgenstein began to doubt the foundational claim of Russell's argument, that mathematics could be reduced to logic. He began working on his own philosophy. But not 3 years later, a historical event known at the time as the Great War threw Europe into chaos. Wittgenstein fought for the Austrians. Unlike a, perhaps, stereotypical son of the upper classes, he did not attempt to use his family name to avoid combat, but rather he requested a hazardous post, for the express purpose of wishing to face death. He had read William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, and learned there that such experiences often occurred in the face of death. Eventually, Wittgenstein got his wish, and was sent to fight the Italians. He was captured, and while in the POW camp, finished revising his first great work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. He contacted Russell via a letter in 1919 and told him that he had written a book which had worked out all of the problems in philosophy, and asked if there was a way to get the manuscript published while he was still interned. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who was a British Treasury official involved in the Versailles negotiations, was instrumental in seeing that the manuscript was safely sent from the POW camp to Bertrand Russell. Russell also tried to pull some strings to secure Wittgenstein's release from the camp, but he didn't want any preferential treatment. He was simply released with the other Austrian POWs after a total of 9 months in captivity. The Tractatus simply lit the philosophical world afire. After publishing this celebrated work, Wittgenstein then quit philosophy in the 1920s. He retired to a small village where he worked as a school teacher. He told Keynes that the pain of teaching helped him to overcome the pain of doing philosophy, the way that a hot water bottle pressed against the mouth can overcome the pain of a toothache. We're not really going to talk about the Tractatus in these episodes, except insofar as is necessary to understand Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. The basic outline is that in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein gives us a pictorial theory of how sentences convey meaning. He works from the premises that logic is the form of reality. Reality is the totality of facts in the world. The meaning of a name is the object which it names. And a sentence assembles these names together in a logical structure to convey a picture, which is a model of reality. The most famous sentences in the Tractatus are that whatever can be said clearly, and that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. The arguments put forward in the Tractatus were immensely influential on the Vienna Circle, and indeed the whole of analytical philosophy. The appeal of Wittgenstein's approach, I think, is that it provided a criterion for judging whether a sentence was meaningful or not, and grounded that standard in a conception of reality as logical. We should take a moment at this point to consider the views of the Vienna Circle, because I think that will help to elucidate the way in which Wittgenstein's work was taken as a basis for a new kind of philosophy which the Circle felt that Wittgenstein's work provided, in contrast to Wittgenstein's own worldview, which has a mystical side that the Circle would not have entertained or had much patience for. The overarching goal of the Vienna Circle was to subject philosophy to logical rigor. They wanted to sort the wheat from the chaff as far as philosophy is concerned. And whereas in Britain you had figures like Russell who believed that science had much to learn from philosophy, the Vienna Circle tended to view things the other way around. Philosophy needs to learn from science. And perhaps this has something to do with the cultural background that the Vienna Circle is coming out of. Because German idealism had just dominated the scene in the German-speaking philosophy world for basically 2 centuries. And so their attitude, the Circle's attitude, was that it was time for philosophy to get over these metaphysical concerns with Geist and will and all of these dreadfully vague and hazy concepts that they suspected didn't really have a clear meaning and often served to conceal basic logical errors behind complex language. And so the approach of the Circle is basically the same approach that Hume gives at the end of Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. This is commonly known now as Hume's fork. Knowledge is either logical or empirical. A sentence that conveys a meaningful claim is either a demonstrative explanation using logic, or a factual statement of the results of experimental science. As Hume says, all works that don't concern such things. For example, examples of works that don't concern either one would be theology or metaphysics. These ought to be put to the flame. And this similarity between the Circle and Hume is also, it's a bit funny, given that the Vienna Circle consider themselves to represent this new chapter in the history of philosophy. But the position that they came to is, broadly speaking, one that existed even before German idealism was invented. In fact, Kant writes his philosophy in response to this exact position. So there is nothing new under the sun, after all. David Edmonds and John Idenau give a great description in their book, Wittgenstein's Poker, as to where this leads the Circle. Quote, "One powerful appeal of the Vienna Circle stemmed from their simple basic tenet that there were only 2 types of valid statements. There were those that were true or false by virtue of the meaning of their own terms, statements such as, all bachelors are unmarried men, equations such as 2 + 2 = 4, and logical inferences such as all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And there were those that were empirical and open to verification. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. The world is flat, which, being open to verification, is meaningful, even if false. All other statements were, to the Circle, literally meaningless. Thus, since it was impossible to verify whether God existed, religious pronouncements were sent smartly to the intellectual rubbish bin, where metaphysics too consequently belonged. In with this garbage went pronouncements about aesthetics, ethics, and the meaning of life. Statements such as murder is wrong, one should always be honest, and Picasso is a superior artist to Monet could really be understood only as the expression of personal judgments. I disapprove of murder. In my opinion, people should always tell the truth. I prefer Picasso to Monet. Everything is accessible to man, proclaimed the Circle's manifesto. Man is the measure of all things. The main function of philosophy, they held, was not to indulge in metaphysics, but to sharpen and clarify the concepts employed by the scientist. End quote. And so they quote the sophist philosopher Protagoras there in their manifesto, which is interesting to consider. The Circle would seem to stand closer to the sophists in a strange way than to, for example, Socrates, whose core philosophical focus is ethical and concerned with the good life. For the Circle, that's all opinion. We have to focus on clarifying our concepts. Once we do this, we'll see that so much that has been said in philosophy is meaningless rubbish. That, however, is a very different attitude from Wittgenstein's own attitude. We've already mentioned that he wished to face death in battle in order to bring on a religious experience. He had also read Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief so many times that he apparently memorized it. In fact, the final section of the Tractatus concerns the ethical, the aesthetic, these whole worlds of human experience of which it may not be possible to speak clearly, but which Wittgenstein does not seek to discard the way the Vienna Circle did. In many ways, his outlook could be compared to the spirituality of the Taoists, or Zen Buddhists, or even Christian mystics such as Meister Eckhart, these religious sects who adopt a quietist view, not because the mystical and the metaphysical is unimportant, but quite the opposite, because it's the most important thing, and language is never adequate to the task of discussing it. Wittgenstein said that we must remain silent philosophically on these matters because he has a reverence for what cannot be said, not because he considered it unimportant. The fact that we can't make a clear or meaningful statement about the good life doesn't mean there's no such thing as the good life. It just means we can't make a clear and meaningful statement about it. In spite of his intentions to retire from philosophy permanently, Wittgenstein's mind did not seem satisfied to stop. He gave a number of private lectures to the Vienna Circle in the 1920s, which were probably more influential on them than even the Tractatus. He attended some lectures also which began to kindle new questions for him that he'd previously thought to be solved. And eventually Frank P. Ramsey, among others, convinced Wittgenstein to return to Cambridge. He submitted the Tractatus as his doctoral thesis to G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell, and it was accepted. Wittgenstein resumed teaching, and almost immediately he began writing philosophy once again. The works from this period were not published during his lifetime, and they take a far looser form than the Tractatus. The book we're going to discuss today, The Philosophical Investigations, was written over a period of 16 years, from 1929 to 1945, when he finished the final draft. It would eventually be published after Wittgenstein's death in the 1950s. Those years during which the Philosophical Investigations were written were obviously rather eventful for Europe and very trying for Wittgenstein and his family. As Austrian Jews, they immediately found themselves in a precarious position after the rise of the Nazis, and a few years later the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Germany in 1938. Unfortunately, when this happened, 3 of Wittgenstein's sisters were still in Austria. His brother Paul had already fled to Switzerland. But the family was so rich that they were actually able to buy their way out of the country. The way that this worked is that under the Nuremberg laws, the Nazis categorized different levels of how Jewish you were based on how much Jewish ancestry you had. And so the Wittgensteins were classed as full Jews, Volljuden, because of their 3 Jewish grandparents. This classification meant that the Nazis could confiscate all of their assets, take control of their bank accounts, put a tax on them for fleeing. In exchange for paying the Nazis 1.2 million francs and even more in assets, gold, and other things, The family was reclassified as Mischlinge, half-Jews. The Nazis adjusted their records to say that their grandfather, Hermann Wittgenstein, was not the son of the Jewish Moses Meyer Wittgenstein, but the illegitimate son of the Prince of Waldeck, who was not a Jew. Hitler approved the request in February 1939, just days before he invaded Poland. Relatively speaking, Ludwig Wittgenstein was safe in Britain throughout the war. He became a British citizen that same year, but the war obviously did not remain on the continent. While Wittgenstein did not personally experience the bombing campaigns, because Cambridge was rarely targeted, the war was still a time of shortages and rationing and privations. He left the university in 1941 because he felt that it was impossible that he should continue teaching philosophy during the war, and instead he became a dispensary porter, delivering medicine to the patients at a hospital in London. He preferred to work longer shifts, continuing for hours and hours, until he could no longer stand. In the later years of the war, he took a job as a laboratory technician, and after the Allied victory, he would continue again to teach at Cambridge for a few more years. It was during those last years at Cambridge that he had an infamous run-in with a fellow Austrian Jewish philosopher named Karl Popper. This was at a regular event of the Cambridge Moral Science Club, in which a guest lecturer would give a talk and then interact with the members of the club afterwards as a kind of fireside chat. Wittgenstein practically ran this club, but Bertrand Russell was also in attendance at this particular meeting. It was the only time that all three of these figures were together. The details of their meeting are contested, but the popular story is that Wittgenstein began aggressively gesturing at Popper with a hot poker that he'd taken from the fire. And he asked Popper for an example of a moral rule, which prompted Popper to say not to threaten visiting lecturers with hot pokers. At hearing this accusation, this implicit accusation, Wittgenstein stormed out of the room in anger. The differences between Wittgenstein and Popper and the nature of their confrontation is certainly very interesting, but we could spend a whole episode just discussing that. And maybe one day I will do an episode based on the book Wittgenstein's Poker, which is primarily about this, if the audience is interested. But as you may have gathered from this story, among others, Wittgenstein had an intense personality. The intensity of this man, I think, can be immediately seen in his piercing gaze, which characterizes his expressions in the most famous photographs of him. He could be uncompromising when he committed himself to a certain course. He could be tough on his students, but those who studied under him tended to remember him fondly. Those that he mentored saw him as a singular kind of personality, the likes of which they never encountered before or since. He had a strange kind of charisma, a magnetism about him, a kind of je ne sais quoi. He was sometimes subject to mood swings, such as his outburst at Popper, or bouts in which he would place his hands on his head in the middle of a lecture and declare, "I am a damned fool." He might throw the logical positivists for a loop whenever they sought his insights when he chose to teach by reading poetry. And in spite of his incisive, logical mind, we must always remember his mystical side and the reverence that he held for what can't be said. Wittgenstein retired from teaching in 1947. He died of cancer 4 years later in 1951 at 62 years of age. His final words were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." Now, the Wittgenstein that concerns us today is the later Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein II, the Wittgenstein that came back to philosophy, realizing that the problems were not yet solved. The philosophical investigations are the most important work of this period. Now, we're not going to do an exhaustive analysis of all of the ideas or the concepts in philosophical investigations because that would be impossible. This is a very idiosyncratic work in a way. It explores all sorts of topics. It consists of, in the main, 693 sections, many of which can be justifiably called aphorisms. The work circles around many central themes, but he doesn't approach these themes in a straightforward, systematic way. In Wittgenstein's own preface to the work, he explains why this book takes the form that it does. Quote, I have written down all these thoughts as remarks, short paragraphs, sometimes in longer chains about the same subject, sometimes jumping in a sudden change from one area to another. Originally, it was my intention to bring all this together in a book whose form I thought of differently at different times, but it seemed to me essential that in the book the thoughts should proceed from one subject to another in a natural, smooth sequence. After several unsuccessful attempts to weld my results together into such a whole, I realized that I should never succeed. The best that I could write would never be more than philosophical remarks. My thoughts soon grew feeble if I tried to force them along a single track against their natural inclination. And this was, of course, connected with the very nature of the investigation, for it compels us to travel crisscross in every direction over a wide field of thought. The philosophical remarks in this book are, as it were, a number of sketches of landscapes, which were made in the course of these long and meandering journeys." End quote. And that's a very accurate description of what the book is like, but Wittgenstein's telling us that the reason why it's like that is because he didn't want to force his thought into artificial channels. He wanted his thought to be sort of he wanted us to experience it in its own chaotic naturalness, as it were. And so what I want to get across in these episodes, then, would be what most scholars consider to be the core insights of the work. In this first part, we're going to consider the later Wittgenstein's new interpretation of language, which comes with a new conception of what the meaning of a sentence is, in contrast to the picture theory of meaning from the Tractatus. In the second part, we're going to focus on Wittgenstein's insights regarding private language, language's ability to convey inner states or sensations, and what it means to mean something when you say it. But we'll get to all of that next time. So the book begins in the first section with a quote from Augustine's Confessions. Augustine writes, quote, "When grown-ups named some object and at the same time turned towards it, I perceived this, and I grasped that the thing was signified by the sound they uttered, since they meant to point it out. This, however, I gathered from their gestures, the natural language of all peoples, the language that by means of facial expression and the play of the eyes, of the movements of the limbs and tone of voice, indicates the affections of the soul when it desires, or clings to, or rejects, or recoils from something. In this way, little by little, I learnt to understand what things the words which I heard uttered in their respective places in various sentences signified, and once I got my tongue around these signs, I used them to express my wishes." End quote. Wittgenstein then gives his comment, quote, "These words, it seems to me, give us a particular picture of the essence of human language. It is this: the words in language name objects. Sentences are combinations of such names. In this picture of language, we find the roots of the following idea. Every word has a meaning. This meaning is correlated with the word. It is the object for which the word stands. Augustine does not mention any difference between kinds of word. Someone who describes the learning of language in this way is, I believe, thinking primarily of nouns like table, chair, bread, and of people's names, and only secondarily of the names of certain actions and properties, and of the remaining kinds of word as something that will take care of itself." End quote. Wittgenstein then asks us to consider the following use of language, and the fact that he refers to use is very important. He imagines sending someone to the market with written instructions, 5 red apples. He imagines the shopkeeper opening a drawer marked apples and then consulting a color chart to find the color red. He then counts 1, 2, 3, 4 until he reaches 5, taking out an apple every time. The example is already a bit funny because we know that in practice, people don't have to consult a color chart to know what is colored red, nor do they typically have to count from 1 to 5 to bring to mind the concept of 5. Wittgenstein will regularly include such details as these in his thought experiments, in which even the most elementary concepts within the language can be, so to speak, formalized or dramatized, almost in an analogical form, such that we can conceive descriptions by color as meaningful insofar as they refer to a color chart and so on. He does this because it would seem to leave no doubt as to how the concepts themselves are to be established. We have, in effect, a picture of red, a picture of counting to 5, and a picture of apples. Or at least, presumably, in the drawer marked apples, you have the signifier directly attached to the thing that looks like an apple. And so, in a way, this is still within the pictorial theory of words. And yet, even as we can imagine how we would anchor the meanings of these words as such, Wittgenstein then asks, quote, but how does he know where and how he is to look up the word red and what he is to do with the word 5? End quote. Further, he poses the question, quote, what is the meaning of the word 5? No such thing was in question here, only how the word 5 was used. End quote. So, in the Augustinian picture theory of language, perhaps not as rigorous as the one presented in the Tractatus, but nonetheless rather similar, names mean objects. We learn words by assigning the name to the object. We assemble a picture of these objects in order to convey our meaning. But he's now introduced this question of use and left it hanging in the air. The question is how the words are to be used. Wittgenstein continues in section 4, quote, imagine a script in which letters were used for sounds, but also for signs of emphasis and punctuation. A script can be conceived as a language for describing sound patterns, end quote. So, in other words, we might imagine the letters in the sentence, he has arrived, and perhaps, rather than using a period for punctuation, let's say we use the letter X, and let's say that we have an emphasis letter, let's say the letter Y in this case. So you might write the letter Y after arrived to emphasize the arrival. He has arrived. Or place it afterwards to indicate that the arrival really has happened. He has arrived. Or, we could imagine that in response to a question of whether someone has actually arrived or not. Or you might write the letter Y after he to emphasize he has arrived, not someone else. In English, we might indicate such a thing by italics or some other convention. Wittgenstein is saying, imagine it's just another letter in the script. We can conceive of such a writing system. But what he says next to comment on this is very important. Quote, now imagine someone constructing that script as if there were just a correspondence of letters to sounds, and as if the letters did not have completely different functions. Augustine's conception of language is like such an oversimple conception of the script. End quote. So Augustine is describing language as a system of communication in which words signify objects. They mean definite objects or people. And then also actions or qualities, though Wittgenstein says he doesn't even include this. Wittgenstein, of course, does not deny that words can be used to signify objects. But this conception of the word's function in language as the totality of what is going on is a misunderstanding analogous to someone who read this hypothetical script that uses letters for all sorts of different uses, other than to simply designate sounds, and ignored all those other uses of the letters. So words can indicate objects, that's a use for them, but it's not the whole story. And if we think that that's the whole story, we'll misunderstand the complexity of language. Wittgenstein writes in section 3, quote, Augustine, we might say, does describe a system of communication. Only not everything that we call language is this system. And one has to say this in several cases where the question arises, will that description do or not? The answer is, yes, it will, but only for this narrowly circumscribed area, not for the whole of what you were purporting to describe. End quote. In section 2, Wittgenstein introduces this thought experiment. He asks us to imagine a language in which the description given by Augustine is essentially correct. Later he says, this could conceivably be the language of a whole tribe. We imagine two individuals, A and B. A is a builder, and B is his assistant. They have words for 4 objects, blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. A calls out the name of the object, B retrieves it. Wittgenstein will repeatedly return to this example of this hypothetical language throughout this text, mainly the first third or so, and he will introduce many variations of it. Wittgenstein will use this thought experiment for many different purposes to show many different things. Later in section 6, Wittgenstein imagines how it is that children in this tribe could be brought up to learn this language. He says that through ostensive teaching of words, by gesturing to the objects and making the sound associated with it, pointing at a slab and saying the word slab, that will create an association between object and word. And it's even very likely that the child will begin to form a picture of the object in connection with the word, or with the utterance of this sound. But then Wittgenstein asks, quote, if this does happen, is this the purpose of the word? Yes, it may be the purpose. But in the language in section 2, it is not the purpose of the words to evoke images. It may, of course, be discovered that it helps to attain the actual purpose. But if this is the effect of the ostensive teaching, am I to say that it affects an understanding of the word? With different instruction, the same ostensive teaching of these words would have affected a quite different understanding. End quote. So, in this hypothetical language of the builders, the purpose of the signifier is not to create a mental picture, nor does this mental picture amount to understanding of the object in any sort of absolute sense, because the understanding accords with the nature of the instruction, which is aimed at the purpose of that instruction. In this case, the purpose of the instruction is building, facilitating this group activity between A and B, in which A builds and B assists. In section 7, Wittgenstein will name just what this activity is. Quote, in the practice of the use of language in section 2, one party calls out the words, the other acts on them. However, in instruction in the language, the following process will occur. The learner names the objects, that is, he utters the word when the teacher points at the stone. Indeed, there will be an even simpler exercise. The pupil repeats the words after the teacher, both of these being speech-like processes. We can also think of the whole process of using words in 2 as one of those games by means of which children learn their native language. I will call these games language games, and will sometimes speak of a primitive language as a language game. And the process of naming the stones and of repeating words after someone might also be called language games. Think of certain uses that are made of words in games like ring-a-ring-a roses. I shall also call the whole, consisting of language and the activities into which it is woven, a language game. End quote. So A and B are playing a game together. The game has certain rules, it has a certain objective. The rules are A calls out the name of a sign, B gives the corresponding object. The objective is to build with these objects. Furthermore, it is also a language game when the student repeats the words after the teacher in order to learn how to make the correct sounds, or when the student learns to associate the word with a given object at the teacher's instruction. Wittgenstein writes in section 10, quote, now what do the words of this language signify? How is what they signify supposed to come out other than in the kind of use they have? End quote. The phrase use determines meaning as regards language. At this point, it's almost a cliche. I don't think it would be particularly controversial to put forward the notion that words acquire their meaning through use, or that their meaning changes when words are used differently. And an easy example of this would be the word guy. I mean, people greet their friends by saying, hey guys, but the term originally comes from Guy Fawkes, a terrorist who tried to blow up the British Parliament. Remember the 5th of November. And in the centuries that followed, the term became a slang term for disreputable-looking men. Men who were poorly dressed and ugly, maybe suspicious-looking. By the mid-1800s, it shifted and became a term for men in general, and in our own times it's become a totally neutral term. It's even a gender-neutral term, and it would be very silly indeed to say that when a woman greets her friend group, also women, by saying, hey you guys, that she's using the term wrongly, as if its meaning was bound to its origins or to its etymology. The word no longer refers to men or to disreputable-looking men or to Guy Fawkes himself. It has a new meaning. But this is a rather banal point about the natural changes that occur in language. One could still approach this example with what we might call the naive view and say the point of the word guy was always to signify a definite something. The words always had a definite meaning, but that this meaning simply changed. What it signifies has changed, but it's still a thing that is still a sound that names an object. Wittgenstein would counter that in every case the word has been part of some game we're playing, in which it plays a role according to the circumstances of the game and its objectives and rules. And in every case, even if it does signify something, or cause an association with a mental picture, that's according to the purposes of the game in question. It never has an absolute meaning, quote unquote, whatever that would mean to speak of an absolute meaning. It only has a meaning relative to the game it is a part of. And in a way, you could argue that this is a far more postmodern point. I mean that in the colloquial sense of that term, than anything written by the postmodernists, because the point is not simply that there is, a definite meaning that might change according to use. There's no meaning beyond the use. There's nothing concrete that we can appeal to, nothing that stands firm outside of the context of a given language game. In other words, we're untethering language. We're no longer anchoring it in this sort of logical, comprehensive view of the world in which every name signifies something definite. To speak a bit more about language in terms of the use to which it is put, Wittgenstein has another metaphor concerning tools. This is in section 10. Quote, "Think of the tools in a toolbox. There is a hammer, pliers, a saw, a screwdriver, a ruler, a glue pot, glue, nails, and screws. The functions of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects, and in both cases there are similarities." End quote. In section 14 he continues, quote, "Suppose someone said, all tools serve to modify something, so a hammer modifies the position of a nail, a saw the shape of a board, and so on. And what is modified by a ruler, a glue pot, and nails? Our knowledge of a thing's length, the temperature of the glue, the solidity of the box. Would anything be gained by this assimilation of expressions?" End quote. And he ends the section there. We can either take this as an open question or as rhetorical. I tend to take it as rhetorical because the definition of a tool as something which modifies something else is such a generalized, abstracted notion of what a tool is that it bears no practical significance in terms of helping us to understand the actual use of specific tools. And you have to stretch the definition of modify pretty far to say the ruler is modifying our knowledge of the length of something when we use it to measure. It seems that one could include many things in this definition that aren't tools. A virus, for example, modifies your cells. And we have to stretch it so far to include the ruler or any other tool that measures things, such that we're no longer modifying the physical world, but our knowledge. In which case, a book is a tool. You could say a public speaker giving a lecture on thermodynamics is a tool. So it becomes such a broad term that it no longer clarifies. And this entire impulse to find an exact definition ends up telling us nothing about the actual matters of fact. Later in the text, Wittgenstein will criticize or implicitly criticize this desire for exactness in our concepts. Perhaps this search for exactness is part of a language game called philosophy. But what does it get us exactly to be able to say with exactitude what a tool is or what a game is? Why can't we have do with an inexact concept? This is in 71, quote, "One can say that the concept of a game is a concept with blurred edges. But is a blurred concept a concept at all? Is a photograph that is not sharp a picture of a person at all? Frege compares a concept to a region and says that a region without clear boundaries can't be called a region at all. This presumably means that we can't do anything with it. But is it senseless to say, stay roughly here? Imagine that I were standing with someone in a city square and said that. As I say it, I do not bother drawing any boundary, but just make a pointing gesture, as if I were indicating a particular spot. And this is just how one might explain what a game is." End quote. So very early on in the text, Wittgenstein has come to an understanding of language that flips over the table regarding the hypothesis that it's simply a system of communication in which sounds are assigned a meaning and designate something signified, and this system of signifiers produces an understanding. Quote, "If we say every word in the language signifies something, we have so far said nothing whatever, unless we explain what distinction we wish to make." End quote. He draws our attention to the fact that even the use of language in which the main activity seems to consist in signification of objects, such as the language consisting of the words block, slab, pillar, beam, the meaning is determined according to the rules of the game being played and the context. He says in a later section, we could even imagine that in this language, the utterance slab is equivalent to the English phrase, bring me a slab. But in this language, they don't have the words bring, me, or a. They just say slab, and it has the same meaning. And we don't even have to imagine this as just like a primitive language or something like this. I mean, if you work in a kitchen, you'll hear people just call out the name of the object they need without having to say a full sentence. Or, if you've seen a medical drama where doctors are operating and one of them says scalpel, right? He doesn't have to say, please bring me a scalpel. He can just call it out, and the nurse or whoever knows what to do, right? So why are they able to understand this without these other words and the grammatical construction that we're used to using, or that we think is an essential part of the communicating in a sentence? Well, how does the man sent to the marketplace with the note reading 5 red apples know that he is to procure 5 red apples from the market and bring them back? How does the shopkeeper know that the note means to give me 5 red apples? The answer is context, circumstances. If a general on the battlefield handed a note to his adjutant that read 5 red apples, where the adjutant was expecting orders or battle plans, he would think that the general had lost his mind. We might say that these 3 words would be meaningless in the context of the game being played, which is, in that case is the game of war. We could also imagine another situation in which 5 red apples is a military code, which only a few of the top brass understand. And that phrase might be unintelligible to the adjutant, but the other general who is being delivered the note would know exactly what it means. The phrase is a sensible part of their language game. Now, does Wittgenstein then come up with a comprehensive system for understanding how language games work? Well, in answer to this, can you come up with a universal and everywhere applicable definition for the word game? Can you come up with a universal definition of tool that actually enhances our understanding of what a tool is in every circumstance? Arguably, we can do no such thing. So by referring to all of these different uses of language as different games, Wittgenstein is by no means trying to reduce our understanding of language to one concept or one definition. It's quite the opposite. This is in section 66. Quote, consider, for example, the activities we call games. Board games, card games, ball games, athletic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say they must have something in common, or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you won't see something that is common to all, but similarities, affinities, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. Look, for example, at board games with their various affinities. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out and others appear. When we pass next to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are they all entertaining? Compare chess with tic-tac-toe. Or is there always winning and losing, competition between players? Think of solitaire. In ball games, there is winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of singing and dancing games. Here we have the element of entertainment, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? And the upshot of these considerations is, we see a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing. End quote. In the very next section, 67, he continues, quote, I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, and so on and so forth, overlap and crisscross in the same way, and I shall say, games form a family. End quote. This notion of family resemblance is among the core concepts that Wittgenstein employs in these investigations. And it is amazing how clear and straightforward he can be in conveying these ideas that make impossible any absolutism about linguistic meaning. We don't form logical sets with our words that group things according to an essential identity between them. Now, don't get me wrong, you could do that as part of a certain language game, the language game of the logician or the analytic philosopher. That would be a game that seeks conceptual exactitude. But the key point is we don't need to do this in order to know what a game is, or perhaps more importantly, to use the concept of game, to play the games. And you might say, what if we, by fiat, create a new definition of the word games that does convey some essential identity? Like, all this proves is that our definitions just need to be refined, and we need to exclude the games that don't fit this identity that we decide. So, for example, we might say, it is competition. That's what defines a game. Solitaire is out. Throwing a ball against a wall by yourself is out. Those activities, they're not really games. Wittgenstein would say, that's fine, perhaps, for whatever language game you're trying to play right now, but that wouldn't be how the word game is used in the broader language game. It's perfectly meaningful in our language to say, he's playing that game by himself. You don't get to ignore the usage of the word and say it ought to really mean something else, something more definite, something more congenial to the tastes of the logician. Don't think, but look at the usage. But this means we can't ever say universally in all times and all places, language games work like this. We can't say how many rules they have to have or the kinds of rules. We can't attribute a definite nature to the objectives. We can't produce any understanding of games in themselves, abstracted from the circumstances and the context. This is in 65, quote, instead of pointing out something common to all that we call language, I'm saying that these phenomena have no one thing in common, in virtue of which we use the same word for all. But there are many different kinds of affinity between them, and on account of this affinity, or these affinities, we call them all languages, end quote. Remember that Wittgenstein has said he will use the phrase language game for both games within the language and for language itself. So when we speak of a language, we're necessarily speaking of a game, but within languages there are sub-languages, such that within English, which is a language game, we play other language games in which English words are used in different ways than they might be, quote-unquote, ordinarily used. And I would put ordinarily in quotes because it's hard to say what the ordinary use of a word might be. Because what is the quote-unquote ordinary game we play in English? Is there a use of English that can be extracted from specific games that we play in different times and places over the course of life? Because even the most basic information being conveyed, in a sense, presupposes a whole context in which the conveyance of that information is part of some activity, some objective, some human action. And because the language is not a private game, but involves multiple players, the use of the word is always connected to the activities and the objectives and the actions of others, not just ourselves. Now, keep in mind, Wittgenstein is not speaking here as a metaphysician. These aren't claims about epistemology, certainly not about ontology, but claims about grammar. Wittgenstein, as everyone knows, is a philosopher of language. He's not talking about the objective world, whatever that might mean, but what we're doing when we use language to talk about the objective world. Now, these investigations have, of course, a very serious consequence for metaphysics. In a way, Wittgenstein creates a more extreme criterion for division than Kant's phenomena noumena split, because Kant is dividing the thing as it is perceived from the thing in itself. Wittgenstein is dividing the thing even as it's perceived from the thing as it is talked about. The thing as it's talked about is, in some sense, that's different from the way it's perceived or the way it, quote-unquote, really is. In section 90, he writes, quote, we feel as if we had a right to see right into phenomena. Yet our investigation is directed not towards phenomena, but rather, as one might say, towards the possibilities of phenomena. What that means is that we call to mind the kinds of statements we make about phenomena. Our inquiry is a grammatical one, end quote. The way I would approach this claim is with the suggestion that the naive realist view of language, the idea that we speak in order to define and therefore convey states of affairs, that language names objects, makes communication of objective facts possible, sort of like realist view of language. That's a view of human existence as though we were like disinterested minds whose only concern is to catalog phenomena or something like this. But we are active beings. We have goals and aims and desires. We don't create language to see right into phenomena, as he puts it, as if the name gave us that insight. We create language, we create the name in order to use things, to use phenomena. And so language games therefore concern the possibilities for phenomena first and foremost, possibilities for use. If we weren't playing a game, we had no use for the objects in our games, we wouldn't have named them. The naming is a part of a game. It has an objective. There are rules to it. Now, does this mean that we can then have done with the issue of naming? Well, no, because the significance of a name, the part the name plays in the language game, can't be understood in this general abstracted way just by calling it a game. This is in 38. Quote, "We call very different things names. The word name serves to characterize many different, variously related kinds of use of a word." End quote. So indeed, we have many uses for names. There are many different kinds of naming. You can name an object, you could name a process, such as when we name the boiling point or the freezing point, and then fix it with an exact temperature, which is even the whole system of measuring temperature is in itself another language game, and there are different ways of doing it. When we name what the freezing point is, we need exactitude, but when we name a region, as Wittgenstein points out, oftentimes the edges are blurry. And in fact, it might be somewhat deceptive, like self-deceptive to imagine a clean, sharp line can be drawn around a region. Here where I live in Texas, in the east it's very sort of subtropical, in the west it's semi-arid. There's not like, you can draw dividing lines at various different points to kind of carve up the regions of the state. But if you drive across the whole state, which I've done, you will see the change very gradually happen. The concept of a regional border is inherently a fuzzy one. When we name a philosophical concept, are we really doing the same thing as when we name a person? And while somebody with a scientific purposes may want to use their names in a very exact and precise way, somebody who's doing marketing or promotion of a product is going to choose their name in a way that attracts and might even be deceptive and misrepresent the product. Wittgenstein acknowledges in another section that when it comes to designating the names of objects, which after all is just one type of thing that names designate, we could justifiably imagine it as analogous to sticking a name tag on something. We can imagine the builder language teaching people to use it by sticking a post-it note on the building materials, reading, for example, slab. But this understanding of naming is insufficient even when it comes to objects if it stops here. In 26, Wittgenstein writes, quote, "Naming is something like attaching a name tag to a thing. One can call this a preparation for the use of a word. But what is the preparation for?" End quote. He continues in the next section, quote, "We name things and then we can talk about them. We can refer to them and talk. As if what we did next were given with the mere act of naming. As if there were only one thing called talking about things, whereas in fact we do the most various things with our sentences." End quote. So language itself is not just one thing. We often inquire into language as though it is, as if we've really said anything when we say that the purpose of language is to be able to talk about things, as if we've explained something by saying the name assigns a name tag. But of course there are many different kinds of naming or reasons for naming or purposes behind naming, just as there are many different reasons for talking about things. There are so many thought experiments in this text. Really, I don't know what number you would come to if you were to do an analysis of it, but it wouldn't surprise me if more than 50% of the text is thought experiments. But I think why this is that Wittgenstein wants to draw our attention to the many specific, particular, and peculiar uses of language that we can imagine, or which are conceivable, or which we can perceive if we reflect about ordinary, everyday examples. Don't think, but look. Wittgenstein himself had previously operated from the framework that there were basically three types of sentences: assertions, questions, and orders: declarative, interrogative, and imperative. In philosophical investigations, his new conception of language makes such a tripartite division seem somewhat quaint. He points out, for example, that the order from builder A to assistant B could take the grammatical form 5 slabs, but B's report to A of how many slabs there are might also take the grammatical form 5 slabs. If B mistakes or mishears what A said, he might, with a questioning tone, ask, 5 slabs? The grammatical construction is exactly the same, but the meaning's different in all 3 cases. The first use is telling B to do something, the second reports information, the third asks for clarification. Wittgenstein goes on to criticize Frege, who said that every assertion contains an assumption. Wittgenstein again denies these hard and fast rules for interpreting what we're doing with language, according to assertions of these necessary components of types of statements. For example, Wittgenstein says we can imagine a culture with a language in which every assertion is phrased as a question, followed by an affirmative answer. They might say, "Is it raining?" "Yes." Would that type of grammatical construction be evidence that a necessary part of every assertion is a question? See, we're always being misled by studying these particular situations and then extrapolating them into universal, everywhere true necessities. And then coming up with these classification schemata for categorizing different types of games we play under general headings. But is that really the way it is? And so Wittgenstein asks in 23, quote, "But how many kinds of sentence are there? Say, assertion, question, and command? There are countless kinds, countless different kinds of use of all the things we call signs, words, sentences. And this diversity is not something fixed, given once and for all, but new types of language, new language games, as we might say, come into existence, and others become obsolete and get forgotten." The word language game is used here to emphasize that speaking of a language is part of an activity or of a form of life. Consider the variety of language games in the following examples and in others: giving orders and acting on them, describing an object by its appearance or by its measurements, constructing an object from a description, a drawing, reporting an event, speculating about the event, forming and testing a hypothesis, presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams, making up a story and reading one, acting in a play, singing rounds, guessing riddles, cracking a joke, telling one, solving a problem in applied arithmetic, translating from one language into another, requesting, thanking, cursing, greeting, praying. It is interesting to compare the diversity of the tools of language and of the ways they are used, the diversity of kinds of word and sentence, with what logicians have said about the structure of language. This includes the author of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, end quote. That author is, of course, Wittgenstein himself. So what did Wittgenstein say in the Tractatus about the structure of language that is relevant here to understanding the philosophical investigations? We've already mentioned the picture theory of language given there. The elements of a sentence, the words, combine in a manner akin to the elements of a picture. The words that make up the picture name the objects that comprise it. The picture is a model of reality, and propositions give us, therefore, a picture of reality. The later Wittgenstein suggests, here in Philosophical Investigations, that this account does not sufficiently describe the diversity of the uses of words. Quote, "A picture held us captive, and we couldn't get outside it, for it lay in our language, and language seemed only to repeat it to us inexorably." End quote. We can understand how the picture explanation misleads us by analogy to the idea of language as conveying pictures, insofar as the picture does not tell you how to use it. We can imagine, for example, an errand boy sent to the grocer not with a written phrase in hand, but a picture of 5 red apples. How does one use such a picture? Well, perhaps it's the custom at the marketplace to give one's order in the form of a picture. But does this exhaust all possible uses for the picture of 5 red apples and other potential games? Not by a long shot. Wittgenstein writes, quote, "Imagine a picture representing a boxer in a particular fighting stance. Well, this picture can be used to tell someone how he should stand, should hold himself, or how he should not hold himself, or how a particular man did stand in such and such a place, and so on." End quote. So the image could be a how-to, it could be a how not to. and the thing you're being instructed as to how to do or not to do. That's also not an objective fact of the image, but the use we make of it. We could be learning about the stance or the way to hold your hands. It could even be a depiction of a certain facial expression that to the boxer, the person trying to learn boxing, might not be relevant, but perhaps as a journalist, it might be relevant to you, right? Or any number of other possibilities. Could we show someone what red means by pointing to something that isn't red? That's another thing that he says, because of course the picture could be a how not to. The way that we might instruct someone who's learning English in trying to, find some way to demonstrate what modesty means by pointing to an arrogant man and saying he is not modest. Would it be possible to even convey through ostensive teaching even basic sort of designations like colors in this way? When we direct our attention to a color or point out a color, are we always doing the same thing? You could point out a shade of blue in the process of admiring a work of art, or you could be the artist. You could be attending to your color palette, trying to figure out the right shade of blue. Or perhaps you could be looking up at the sky, trying to divine the weather. Or if someone hands you, for example, a picture of a green leaf, you could be meant to draw your attention to the particular shade of green, or the particular shape of the leaf, or either detail could be superfluous. And so when we attempt to demonstrate things by pointing to an object or a picture, or through words or with a literal picture, it's not just the act of pointing to the object that conveys meaning, because there are many different kinds of pointing, different purposes we may wish to fulfill by the pointing. Even if somebody draws our attention to a specific part of a picture, we must always ask why, for what purpose do we draw our attention to this part? What are we supposed to do? By pointing at that part, what do you want me to see? What action do you want me to take? In early Wittgenstein, in the Tractatus, you have this idea of logical simples. A simple is the most basic statement of a fact that's indivisible into further pieces, and these simples are then composited into propositions. But now he asks, just what are these simple and constituent parts of which reality is composed? Well, quote, what are these simple and constituent parts of a chair? The pieces of wood from which it is assembled, or the molecules or the atoms? Here the point is, in what sense composite? Does my visual image of the tree, of this chair, consist of parts? End quote. Well, does it? I think most of us will say, not really. And he later asks us to imagine asking someone to retrieve something from the other room. You don't say to go get me the broom, go get me that broomstick that's connected to the brush that's in the other room. Is such a description how we normally would play the language game? No, we would just say, get the broomstick. More importantly, by breaking down our description into parts, would we convey our meaning better than just saying, bring the broomstick? That would seem to be pretty doubtful. Consider a chessboard. We could just as easily say that it is 32 black and 32 white squares. And then, do we include the pieces as part of the chessboard? I mean, if we want to play a game of chess, we'd better have both. A chess set is clearly not one thing, but if I say, meet me at the coffee shop, bring your chess set, is that somehow a less clear explanation than saying, meet me at the coffee shop, bring a board with 32 black and 32 white squares and a set of pieces, both black and white, consisting of a king, a queen, 2 rooks, 2 bishops, 2 knights, and 8 pawns? No, the more exact description is far worse. And we might ask then, do we even see the parts of the chair, or do we just see it as a thing to sit down on? I mean, I would assume the carpenter who makes the chair will see the parts, and will regularly engage in a language game in which speaking of the parts, perhaps with someone assisting him in building it, will be essential. But this leads us to the understanding that whether something is simple or composite is not, it's not really, for one, it's not some absolute truth of the object. We're describing here how we talk about the object. And when we look at these things as part of how we talk about the object, how it's used, we don't really use, sentences aren't really made up of simple or composites propositions. The way we talk about it, whether we see the whole thing as one or whether we see the parts, whether we focus on one part above the other parts, that has to do with how we're going to put the object to use, what our objectives are, what kind of game we're playing. It doesn't really have to do with some sort of objective logical structure of the sentence. Quote, how would we explain to someone what a game is? I think we'd describe games to him, and we might add the description, this and similar things are called games. And do we know any more ourselves? Is it just that we can't tell others exactly what a game is? But this is not ignorance. We don't know the boundaries because none have been drawn. To repeat, we can draw a boundary for a special purpose. Does it take this to make the concept usable? Not at all, except perhaps for that special purpose. End quote. So drawing an exact boundary, as we've said, might make sense according to our purposes. Sometimes we need to see the parts. Sometimes we need to see the whole structure or a whole superstructure. Sometimes exact lines are needed. Sometimes a blurry line will do. Sometimes the blurry line is even preferable. As in the previous example, wait for me roughly here. That's a more reasonable order than expecting that the person waiting will sit perfectly still and not move at all. Now, the astute listener will notice that there are certain features of the game that do seem to occur without fail in the examples so far. For example, rules. We've often invoked the idea of the game having rules or an objective. But even to say we've somehow nailed down the language game by understanding it as something with rules, that would be to forget that we're dealing with this category of, like this familial resemblance based on crisscrossing, overlapping affinities. For what is meant by a rule, what constitutes a rule, how the rule is used, whether we would even recognize the features of certain games as rules, none of that can be generally abstracted into a rule of rules. We can only understand the words in a language game according to the rules, but we can only know how the rules are to be understood by looking at the specific game. Quote, is there not also the case where we play and make up the rules as we go along, and even where we alter them as we go along? End quote. In the next section, he continues, quote, speaking of the application of a word, I said that it is not everywhere bounded by rules. But what does a game look like that is everywhere bounded by rules, whose rules never let a doubt creep in, but stop up all the gaps where it might? Can't we imagine a rule regulating the application of a rule and a doubt which it removes, and so on? End quote. And he goes on to say that removing all doubt is impossible. If we consider that doubting is, in theory, possible for basically any proposition. We don't need to bother ourselves with removing every possible doubt, because it's possible to doubt that when you step out of your front door, you might unexpectedly slip down into an abyss. It's even possible to doubt that when one billiard ball strikes another, that it will not produce motion. It's possible to doubt that bread will nourish you or that fire will burn you. All we need to say to this is that removing all these doubts is not necessary to play the game. And I think what Wittgenstein is getting at here, although this is me interpolating a little bit, with the example of the game that is perfectly bounded by the rules, he's getting at the notion that the rule doesn't interpret itself. You can lay down the rules in black and white, like, for example, in the United States Constitution. And hundreds of years later, there's still plenty of dispute over how those rules are to be interpreted. In fact, there were disputes within the first years of America's existence. Certainly we have them now. So now we need judges and Supreme Court justices to interpret those rules. But how do we know they're interpreting correctly? Maybe we need a rule of interpretation that the justices have to follow. And that would then require a new judicial office of the Super Supreme Court Justice to interpret the rules for interpreting rules and make sure these lesser Supreme Court justices are interpreting according to them. I mean, do you see how that whole process could go on forever? So you can always have some doubt, and you can establish some rule for enforcing the rule, but then you might have to have a rule for enforcing that rule. And what if a doubt creeps in when we're applying the rules concerning how the rules are to be interpreted, and so on and so forth? It never ends. And so even in the rules of the game, exactitude is not needed, and perfect exactitude may in fact be impossible. And how we interpret what the rule is telling us to do may change for any number of reasons. Quote, a rule stands there like a signpost. Does the signpost leave no doubt about the way I have to go? Does it show which direction I am to take when I have passed it, whether along the road or the footpath or cross country? But where does it say which way I am to follow it, whether in the direction of its finger or, for example, in the opposite one? So I can say that the signpost does, after all, leave room for doubt, or rather it sometimes leaves room for doubt and sometimes not. And now this is no longer a philosophical proposition, but an empirical one. End quote. So we might think of the counterexample of, the game of chess, once again. Not a lot of room for interpreting the rules. In every position, there are a number of legal moves and a number of illegal moves. You don't get to interpret your way out of the fact that you have to move your king when it's in check, or else take the checking piece or intercept it. And by the way, Wittgenstein uses quite a few chess metaphors and examples, so I feel I have the right to use them liberally myself in this episode. But this is why the rule, imagined as a signpost, sometimes leaves room for doubt and sometimes not. It's an empirical matter. You have to look to the matters of fact to know whether the rule is open to interpretation or not. Sometimes it will be. The sole fact of the existence of the rule, however, is not enough to say that all doubts have been settled. And we can't be so hasty as to suggest there's some uniform way in which rules are formed or applied. The application of the rule is also a convention of the game. Wittgenstein picks this up again later in the text in 198, quote, "But how can a rule teach me what I have to do at this point? After all, whatever I do can, on some interpretation, be made compatible with the rule." No, that's not what one should say. Rather this, every interpretation hangs in the air with what it interprets and cannot give it any support. Interpretations by themselves do not determine meaning. So is whatever I do compatible with the rule? Well, let me ask this. What has the expression of a rule, say a signpost, got to do with my actions? What sort of connection obtains here? Well, this one, for example. I have been trained to react in a particular way to this sign, and now I do so react to it. But with this, you have pointed out only a causal connection, only explained how it has come about that we now go by the signpost, not what this following the sign really consists in. Not so. I have further indicated that a person goes by a signpost only insofar as there is an established usage, a custom. End quote. And I must say, upon reading this work, Philosophical Investigations, once again, after having just read Hume very recently, it really jumped out to me how Wittgenstein retreads some of the same ground that Hume does. And apparently, I looked this up because I was interested in this. From my understanding, he did this without actually having read Hume, or not. Maybe he had a passing familiarity, but he didn't really read Hume's works. Apparently, Wittgenstein did not have a comprehensive knowledge of Western philosophy. And yet he independently re-engineers some of the same propositions that the previous philosophers did. Wittgenstein will go on in the latter sections of the work to raise questions about the logical certainty of cause and effect, when in fact we just have, in so many words, repeated conjunctions. And then here we see that Wittgenstein invokes custom as an explanation of how we act in practical terms. We also see him invoke the everyday usages and common sense understanding of things as his guide, so to speak, to keep him from veering off into abstruse philosophical wanderings. So many of the themes of Hume appear here, if not the exact same arguments. But the point he's making here is that rules are not just freely and open to interpretation at all times. The interpretation hangs in the air with the thing being interpreted. There may be doubts about a rule's application, but these ambiguities are only sensible in the broader context of the game that the participants are largely committed to playing, such that someone who just disingenuously tries to interpret every rule to their own liking and interpret their every action as within the rules, such a type is generally seen as a bad player or even as a bad person. We might say that the places where it is appropriate to become contentious over the interpretation of a rule will be determined by the situation, by the other rules, by the objectives of the game, and so on. It's because of a seriousness with which we take the rules and a sincere attempt to play the game that sometimes we contend over interpretation, but that's very different from sort of like troll interpreting the rules, right? From just contending over the rules at every turn. That can actually be a detriment to playing the game. It can actually stop you from really playing the game. And so we might simply ask, are you interpreting how this rule is applied in a way that facilitates the game, or are you interpreting to make the game impossible? And perhaps more importantly, Wittgenstein brings in this theme that occurs throughout the text, that of training. It's not just that the signpost could be interpreted in any way you want. We've trained one another to read the signpost as part of for example, the navigating the interstate highway game. Not always a very fun game, but sometimes it is. When you get a driver's license, you're supposed to be trained to play this game, to recognize the signs, to respond to them appropriately. The signs tell you to do something, and they have a meaning determined by their use in the game of navigating the highways. And if there's a question over how to interpret a road sign, it's not generally because you're trying to be obtuse or obscurantist. I mean, sometimes in certain contexts, road signs can be rather confusing. If you ever drive through Dallas or Chicago, and I've certainly been on tour with my band trying to navigate an unfamiliar city, and multiple passengers in the van take different interpretations of what the signs on the highway are telling us to do in order to get to our destination or avoid the toll road or whatever. And we'll argue not because any interpretation is equally valid or something like this, but because we all want to play the game to the best of our ability. We all want to achieve our purpose of getting to our destination. And so we're sincerely trying to follow the rules and interpret them in the correct way. And that's what it really means to play the game. And Wittgenstein says something following from all this that's very illuminating in section 201. Quote, "This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule because every course of action can be brought into accord with the rule. The answer was, if every course of action can be brought into accord with the rule, then it can also be brought into conflict with it. And so there would be neither accord nor conflict here. That there is a misunderstanding here is shown by the mere fact that in this chain of reasoning, we place one interpretation behind another, as if each one contented us at least for a moment, until we thought of yet another lying behind it. For what we thereby show is that there is a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, but which from case to case of application is exhibited in what we call following the rule and going against it. That's why there is an inclination to say every action according to a rule is an interpretation, but one should speak of interpretation only when one expression of a rule is substituted for another." End quote. So it's sensible to speak of interpretations, and there's multiple expressions of a rule are possible. They can be swapped in and out. But the key idea here, in my view, is that there's a way of grasping a rule without interpreting it. Case-to-case application, as he says. You grasp the rule by following it, eo ipso, and you're instructed as to how to follow it by being trained. This training is itself a game played between teacher and learner. The teaching inducts you into a knowledge of the customs that govern the game. And then in following those customs, it's presumed that you're actually trying to play the game. Quote, "To follow a rule, to make a report, to give an order, to play a game of chess are customs, usages, institutions. To understand a sentence means to understand a language. To understand a language means to have mastered a technique." End quote. Why would that be the case? Because languages, again, are not just passive storehouses of signifiers. The real insight throughout this work is that languages are all about doing things. If you learn to play the guitar, in the course of doing that, you'll also learn a language. When you fully understand that language, you'll have mastered the technique to play the language games that are shared by guitar players. Again, it's not literally a foreign language. The words are generally in English, but they have a certain application that's not intelligible to everybody. Like in Back to the Future, when Marty McFly jumps on stage and says, "Standard blues riff in B, watch me for the changes and try to keep up." What does standard blues riff in B mean? It's perfectly sensible to me, but it could easily be nonsense to someone. For example, anyone from the hundreds or thousands of years of human civilization who lived before the blues existed. If you don't know what the blues is, that's a pretty key part of that sentence. That isn't going to be intelligible to you. And they might think it refers to a color, right? When in fact here, we're talking about a certain style of music. And genres are very much, I would say, could be described as something with a family resemblance, like games or tools. It's not really, it's going to be very difficult to nail down exactly what the blues is. Let's say you don't know what a riff is. Or perhaps you think you do, but you don't. Maybe you understand the word riff in the sense of a comedic riff, and saying that the song is in B. Well, we're just giving a letter designation, but that's telling us very important information about the scale and the mode. That combining that with the knowledge that it's in the blues and a standard riff, you can kind of figure out pretty much roughly what Marty is going to play and follow along with it. But again, that's just an example of how there's a whole language that grows up around the technique of playing the guitar. So the language is about doing things, and the thing that Marty communicates in that scene is telling everyone how to follow along and do something in this shared activity. Now, perhaps, maybe surprisingly, Wittgenstein keys into the same underlying critique that is made by Nietzsche of language. We might call it the Platonism of language, though Wittgenstein doesn't put it in those terms. And by this I mean the ideal operating in our thought. Perhaps this is one of the main obstacles to the philosopher in keying into this understanding of language presented in the investigations. We mistake the ideal for the real. We're always thinking of these indestructible qualities or essences that endure beyond any particular form or instantiation. And Wittgenstein says in section 100, quote, "We misunderstand the role played by the ideal in our language. We are dazzled by the ideal, and therefore fail to see the actual application of the word game clearly." End quote. And so we wish to use logic to banish any potential vagueness or uncertainty out of the conviction that the ideal is not just an artifact of certain language games, but something which actually exists out there in reality. That there are perfect games that could be played, or perfect applications of the rules, that form a kind of correspondence to a real reality. Quote, "Now it may look as if we were aiming at a particular state, a state of complete exactness, as if this were the real goal of our investigation." End quote. He continues in section 105, quote, "When we believe that we have to find that order, the ideal, in our actual language, we become dissatisfied with what are ordinarily called sentences, words, signs. The sentence and the word that logic deals with are supposed to be something pure and clear-cut, and now we rack our brains over the nature of the real sign." End quote. So this is the purpose, the game being played by the philosophical investigations. We're not looking for what language might ideally do, but what it really does. We're not looking for what Wittgenstein calls the crystalline purity sought by the logician, because after all, this is not a discovery about the world. It was simply a requirement imposed by those same logicians that there ought to be some crystalline purity in the operation of language. But that requirement has revealed itself as unworkable. If we proceed by that requirement, we will not be suited to the task of understanding the reality of language. Even if that particular game might have advantages in for certain specific purposes. He describes the situation as akin to walking on slippery ice, and we can imagine, a pristine sheet of ice, perfectly crystalline, perfectly exact, in that its surface is uniformly flat. Quote, "Just because of that, we are unable to walk. We want to walk, so we need friction, back to the rough ground." End quote. So let's get back to Earth. Let's get back to how language is really used. Wittgenstein writes that the whole inquiry must be, quote, "turned around, but on the pivot of our real need," end quote. And that following this pivot, we will no longer seek to explain, but simply to describe. Quote, "All explanation must disappear, and description alone must take its place," end quote. And this sentiment is all part and parcel with the method that Wittgenstein has used thus far of simply presenting examples and thought experiments, and constantly reminding us that we only know specific instances of games, specific instances of rules, and therefore contingent contextual uses for words. He doesn't really speak in this language, but there's this idea of like the absolute use, the absolute meaning, the universal meaning, and we don't have those, nor do we have explanations for the games we play, and we don't need them. And it might be sensible to ask why people are playing a certain game, or playing this game instead of that one. But you can always ask for an explanation of the explanation. You can always ask why yet again. And in some sense, this is the brilliance of Wittgenstein's framing of things. Because we all understand that in the grand scheme of things, the game justifies itself. When we're talking about playing games, we're talking about just what it means to be alive, right? Again, what it means to be a living, acting being. A game, as he'll later say, embodies a form of life. Life is a series of games, and this is not meant in a trivializing sense. Again, our games can be deadly serious with the context of warfare, for example, the game of warfare. You could even argue that we can only really attain true seriousness in the context of a game, because games are the arena in which we seek our purposes. And, of course, we are most effective at seeking our purposes when we do so as part of a cooperative or competitive activity, as a shared activity. But this is me explaining, whereas Wittgenstein wishes instead to describe. The impulse that he's contending with here is primarily, I would say, the philosophical impulse, the philosopher's impulse to try and see into the essence of things. Remember what Pythagoras said about the philosopher, that the life of man seemed to him to be like those great games played by the Greeks, attended by many different people, some of whom were there to compete, perhaps for glory, some of whom were there to wager and make themselves rich, and others, the philosophers, who were there merely to spectate and inquire into the nature of things. On the one hand, we might say that the philosopher, from Wittgenstein's point of view, is simply engaged in his own particular type of game with its own special purposes. But, perhaps more interestingly, he views this philosophical impulse to try and peer into the nature of things as, to put it one way, estranged from the real meaning of the words. The words the philosopher uses, because one way of putting this, philosophers always use words in a way that's different from their common uses. Not all of the words they use, but oftentimes many of the words they use, they are trying to, they effectively have a different meaning for the philosopher, right? They're not trying to describe the way the word is actually commonly used, but trying to innovate some new usage. For example, quote, when philosophers use a word, knowledge, being, object, I, proposition, sentence, name, and try to grasp the essence of the thing, one must always ask oneself, is the word ever actually used in this way in the language in which it is at home? What we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use, end quote. And this is a somewhat subtle point, in a way. And I think it could be applied to many different philosophers who might, in different ways, help us see Wittgenstein's point here. But let's take, for example, Heidegger. Heidegger will be my whipping boy. Heidegger is concerned with the being of being. The guiding question of philosophy is, what is being? And near the beginning of Being in Time, Heidegger argues, we all appeal to the concept of being every day, in every sentence in which we say something is or is not, or that something can be a certain way. Any number of other phrases that invoke the idea of something's existence, the idea of something's having a being. Now, when someone uses the word is, or the phrase to be, for one, as we've already established, this doesn't actually require a theory of being. Heidegger would actually agree on that point. He says, for example, that the question is the closest one to us, even though it is also the most obscure. But more importantly, is Heidegger's concept of being even the same thing as the concept that is invoked when someone says, the stone is red, or the leaf is green? Are these sentences even claims that involve being? Well, in an earlier section, Wittgenstein points out, quote, in Russian, one says stone red instead of the stone is red. Does the sense they grasp lack the copula, or do they add the copula in thought? End quote. Remember also the musing about the fact that, somebody could say slab and mean bring me a slab. The doctor could say scalpel and mean hand me a scalpel. That, in fact, your words may not be an invocation of being at all. They're being used to attain a certain objective. And I think by now it should be clear, Wittgenstein doesn't think there's some essential nature to the concept to be. The concept to be also plays a role. It plays a role in the game. We don't use to be to indicate an ontological position. We might use it to assign. We might use the phrase to be for any number of reasons. So perhaps we might say only the philosopher is using it to indicate an ontological position. But we might also use it to assign a quality to a thing. The stone is red. And in some languages, invoking the idea of being isn't even necessary for this, right? So are we invoking the idea of being when we say the stone is red? We might also use to be to announce the arrival of a person. He is here. We might use it to judge the quality of a painting. This is beautiful. By searching for the essence of what is said, for the essential meaning of to be in these statements, we're studiously ignoring the actual meaning. We're studiously ignoring the activity and the goals and the context, basically the whole of life that language is a part of. The phrase to be could be used for the most wide variety of linguistic activities. And so Wittgenstein writes in section 489, quote, "Ask yourself, on what occasion, for what purpose do we say this? What kinds of actions accompany these words? Think of a greeting, and what kinds of setting will they be used? And what for?" End quote. And again, we could apply this to many philosophical meditations on the true meaning of certain terms. Heidegger's other concern in being and time is, of course, time. It's another concept over which he and countless philosophers have extracted just pages and pages of metaphysics. And once again, we can attempt to interrogate the word concept, time, under the assumption that its clarification will reveal new truths to us about the world, about our being. But the concept of time, like the concept of being, again, let's describe rather than explain. Let's stop thinking meticulously over these phrases and look at how they're used. These terms are used in the language as word concepts without a full understanding. And in fact, if we required a full understanding of time before using it, hardly anyone would be able to tell the time or use that knowledge to coordinate their activities. Perhaps no one. Wittgenstein quotes from Augustine Confessions, quote, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to someone who asks, I do not know." End quote. And so I think to fast track my argument a bit, we'll find that many, if not most, of the philosophical concepts that we labor over are of this nature. We use these concepts without understanding them because understanding isn't needed. It may seem at this point as if Wittgenstein's goal is to destroy everything interesting that we could say about philosophy. And he may seem to be saying that all of our apparently very interesting philosophical ideas may actually be a misuse or misunderstanding of the actual meanings of the words we're using. Again, the philosophers are always using words in non-conventional ways, but it's actually the convention that tells you what the word means. And Wittgenstein insists that he's only destroying houses of cards here. Again, we're not making ontological claims. Let's remember what we talked about at the beginning of the episode about the mystical side of Wittgenstein. The side of Wittgenstein that's necessarily quietist, and a side of him that acknowledges the whole world beyond language, even though it's pretty much impossible to meaningfully describe it. In any case, Wittgenstein asserts many times in the investigations that thinking can't be said to be the same thing as speaking or talking. One can occur without the other. We can think without speaking. He claims to have had thoughts that were not in the form of words. Perhaps that is where we could really contemplate things like time and being, because that's where we could really contemplate knowledge which is not just bounded by a conventional signifier. Again, that's another uncanny similarity to Nietzsche and his comments, especially in the aphorism on the genius of the species, and just repeated themes throughout his work that whatever is in our depths is essentially incommunicable, and whatever is communicable is what is average, what is common to all. And conversely, Wittgenstein says we can talk without thinking. Many people assume that just because they're talking, they must be thinking. But talking is often just as automatic and thoughtless as the use of our muscle memory when we do physical motion that we've done many times before. Wittgenstein takes it for granted that there's a whole reality beyond language. And even within our own experience, we find things that are impossible to express in language. Wittgenstein's not actually trying to make the world less interesting, is the point I'm getting at. What is most interesting to us is often completely beyond the capabilities of language, and assuming that whatever is in the depths or the profound truths that we're really after have to be encapsulated in language, again, why would we assume that? And so what philosophy often ends up doing is building these houses of cards, these edifices that attempt to do what language really can't do, can't describe, can't explain. And it's no great loss for us to knock them down. If we're serious about the pursuit of wisdom, we ought to know what philosophy can do and what it can't. Quote, "Philosophy must not interfere in any way with the actual use of language, so it can in the end only describe it. For it cannot justify it either. It leaves everything as it is." End quote. And we might ask then, what is philosophy other than another way of talking about things? We could analyze what the game of philosophy consists of. Many philosophers have done this. But in the end, it only describes, it can't explain. Or rather, when it tries to explain, it ends up misusing the words. And so philosophy is always trying to invent new languages, perhaps in order to try in ever new attempts to say what can't be said. This is section 192, quote, "You have no model of this inordinate fact, but you are seduced into using a super expression, might be called a philosophical superlative," end quote. And philosophers love to do this. Present a totally counterintuitive view of the world, accompanied by some impressive expression, like, say, the world is will to power, nothing besides, or God is dead and we have killed him, whatever the case may be, right? Wittgenstein, for his part, takes on the task of effecting this pivot to the words themselves. Of course, I'm referencing Husserl there, to the things themselves. But Wittgenstein says to the words themselves, because, of course, when we speak, what we're speaking is words, not things. We turn our attention to the word, to the statement's use. Quote, "It's as if we could grasp the whole use of a word at a stroke." Well, that is just what we do. That is, we sometimes describe what we do in these words, but there is nothing astonishing, nothing strange about what happens. End quote. Language is actually not a mystery to us at all whenever we understand it as acted, rather than something we have to interpret or explain. Wittgenstein writes in section 120, quote, "When I talk about language, word, sentence, etc., I must speak the language of every day. So is this language too coarse, too material for what we want to say? Well then, how is another one to be constructed? And how extraordinary that we should be able to do anything at all with the one we have." End quote. What I love especially about the later Wittgenstein's view of language that emerges in philosophical investigations is that it is a view that incorporates the rest of human life. Language is not a system of logic or a system of communication or simply a series of names. All of that can be involved, but it can't be extracted from the rest of life. And that might seem like a low bar, but it's a low bar, a low standard to say, well, he doesn't forget about everything else in life besides language in developing his theory. But it's amazing how easy it is for the ideal to deceive us and detach our philosophy from real life. And if we see how life itself informs our understanding, like, for example, there's a great section in 206 where he talks about looking at people speaking in a language we don't know. He writes, quote, "Suppose you came as an explorer to an unknown country with a language quite unknown to you. In what circumstances would you say that the people there gave orders, understood them, obeyed them, rebelled against them, and so on? Shared human behavior is the system of reference by means of which we interpret an unknown language." End quote. And by the way, this is a point that's even grasped by Augustine when he talks about the universal human language being gestures and movements of the eyes and so on. And this leads Wittgenstein to the assertion that there's a kind of physiognomy in everyday life. That is to say, the ability to judge solely from the outward appearance. When people pose idle questions like, how do we really know who's following the rules and who isn't? Well, even in a foreign country, you'd be able to tell who obeys and rebels by context, by facial expressions and gestures, and by their actions of nothing else. He emphasizes around this section, in fact, that in the normal course of playing a game, we follow the rules without having to be compelled, and we do so blindly, thoughtlessly, because we've been trained in the same way that, again, using the example of muscle memory. The question of breaking the rules when it comes to the language game of, for example, shopping at the grocery store, it's not something we struggle with, at least for those of us who don't have antisocial personality disorders or other mental illnesses. Nobody has to compel you to say 5 red apples, please, when you go up to the fruit stand, and to not say some other phrase that would be meaningless in that context. Quote, "The rule can only seem to me to produce all its consequences in advance if I draw them as a matter of course, as much as it is a matter of course for me to call this color blue." End quote. That's our real experience with the rules of language. It's so obvious, so second nature to us, We're all very well trained in playing these games. We don't even have to think about it. These sorts of philosophical objections about what it really is a rule and how do we interpret them, they end up being rather obscurantist. But where do the philosophical investigations leave philosophy? We're going to continue to explore this text next week because there's so much to talk about in this unusual and fascinating book. But before we leave off for this first part this week, I can imagine that some may come to the conclusion that Wittgenstein has closed off the possibility of finding, say, truth in language. By considering the communicative aspect of language as only one use among many others, and depriving the signifier of any essential meaning, is Wittgenstein putting us in a position where language cannot be used truly or falsely? Can it only be, used in accord with the rules of the game or not? Is there even a question of speaking truly or falsely? Well, to this, Wittgenstein has the following to say. This is 241. Quote, "So you were saying that human agreement decides what is true and what is false. What is true or false is what human beings say, and it is in their language that human beings agree. This is agreement not in opinions, but rather in form of life." End quote. And in the following section, quote, "It is not only agreement in definitions, but also, odd as it may sound, agreement in judgments that is required for communication by means of language. This seems to abolish logic, but does not do so." End quote. We must have an agreement in judgment that exists not merely in language, but in our forms of life, in order to establish, for example, the purposes of our games. This does not abolish logic, as Nietzsche would have wholeheartedly agreed. It merely modifies our picture of rational thinking, such that we have to include an evaluative judgment as part of the truth statement. Because after all, what is truth? To quote that great philosopher Pontius Pilate, true or false, as Wittgenstein says, is what human beings say. They're words. These investigations of the meaning of the word as determined by use don't halt with the concepts true and false. When we say this is true, what do we mean by that statement? Potentially many things. Many possibilities exist within our language games. The phrase "this is true" could be you insisting on a version of events while arguing with a friend over your memories of something that happened years ago. It could be the punctuation to an accusation declared in the presence of the accused. It could be a professor's assurance to his students of a counterintuitive claim. It could be the lyric in a song. It could be, indeed, a philosophical claim. What unites all of these uses? Well, they're all statements. We only ever are acquainted with the truth as a quality we assign to certain sentences and propositions. And we only ever need to make that determination, a judgment about whether the qualifier true applies to a statement, when we must make that determination in order to act. But for that, we don't need a philosophical theory of truth with exact definitions and a theory of being. We just need to know what game we're playing. All right, that's it for this week, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Come back next time for part 2 of Wittgenstein 2, when we're going to talk about private language, memory, sensation, and so much more. And now, as accords with the conventions of the language game I'm playing in the podcast, I'll say those 2 words. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.